The battlefield was quiet at first, broken only by the distant rumble of engines. German soldiers crouched low, peering through binoculars, scanning the horizon for the silhouettes they had been trained to fear: enemy tanks, heavy artillery, or advancing infantry columns. Their commanders had warned of an Allied push, but the men of the Wehrmacht expected it to come with steel and thunder. What they saw instead was something altogether unexpected. Across the fields, small shapes began to appear, low to the ground, fast-moving, kicking up clouds of dust as they advanced in groups. They were not tanks, nor armored cars, but something far more numerous: jeeps. Dozens of them at first, then scores more, darting across open ground like swarms of insects. Each carried soldiers, weapons, or supplies. Some towed light artillery, others mounted machine guns, and still more sped back and forth as though multiplying by the minute. Eyewitnesses later described their disbelief. One soldier recalled thinking that for every jeep we saw, another 3 appeared out of nowhere. The battlefield calculations drilled into German officers, tank ratios, artillery placement, expected infantry strength, were suddenly rendered meaningless. Mobility itself had become a weapon, and the Americans wielded it with overwhelming force. The effect was not only tactical but psychological. To German troops, raised on the supremacy of heavy armor, the sight was disorienting. Tanks symbolized power, stability, and engineering dominance. But here, speed and numbers seemed to count for more. Jeeps cut through terrain that bogged down heavier vehicles. They outflanked positions, ferried reinforcements, and seemed to be everywhere at once. German units that expected to face a slow, grinding battle instead found themselves outmaneuvered by waves of light vehicles. The battlefield echoed with new sounds, less the clatter of treads and more the high-pitched whine of engines and the rattle of mounted guns. Dust and exhaust filled the air as jeeps crisscrossed the front, their tires tearing across fields where German tanks could not easily follow. One diary entry, paraphrased years later, described the impression: "We thought the Americans had turned their factories into soldiers. Each jeep was another enemy we could not stop." The tactical implications were immediate. German artillery, designed to target tanks, wasted shells on vehicles too fast and too numerous to pin down. Anti-tank crews who had trained to disable armored beasts found themselves aiming at swarms of smaller targets, only to watch more appear behind them. The battlefield, once predictable, had become a storm of motion. What stunned German soldiers most was not the jeep itself, but the sheer number of them. They realized they were not fighting against individual machines, but against an industrial system capable of producing them in endless waves. Tanks could be destroyed. Trenches could be overrun. But how could an army defeat a swarm that seemed inexhaustible? For men who had marched behind panzers into Poland, France, and Russia, this encounter was sobering. Blitzkrieg had relied on concentrated firepower, precision strikes, and armored superiority. Now the tables were turning. America's answer was not a single, mighty weapon, but a fleet of smaller ones, each multiplying across the battlefield like a rolling tide. As the day wore on, German troops realized they were not facing just soldiers, but the living embodiment of an industrial giant. Every jeep that sped past was a reminder of the factories across the ocean, churning day and night, building not only vehicles, but also the momentum of inevitability. The first encounters with America's arsenal on wheels left a mark that diaries and testimonies later echoed with awe, frustration, and disbelief. In the dust clouds of those advancing jeeps, German soldiers began to glimpse the truth. This was not a battle of machines alone. It was a battle of economies, of production, of nations' ability to sustain war. And as the swarms of jeeps continued to roll forward, the Germans realized something more chilling still. This was only the beginning. In the years leading up to World War II, no weapon captured the German imagination more than the tank. It was not just a machine of war. It was a symbol of modernity, of precision engineering, and of the nation's supposed destiny to dominate Europe. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland in September 1939, it did so behind the iron teeth of its panzer divisions, and the world took notice. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, became synonymous with these armored spearheads. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, though modest by later standards, seemed unstoppable in those early campaigns. Supported by fast-moving infantry and coordinated air power, they sliced through enemy defenses with shocking speed. For German soldiers, tanks were the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, mobile, decisive, and terrifying to those on the receiving end. By 1941, the image of the tank had become central to both German propaganda and German strategy. Newsreels glorified columns of armor advancing through smoke and dust, while posters declared the Panzer to be the invincible weapon of the Reich. When the Tiger tank was unveiled in 1942, with its massive 88mm gun and heavy armor, it was hailed as proof of German engineering superiority. Later, the Panther tank was introduced, blending firepower with speed, and touted as the ultimate answer to Allied armor. To the German people and to many soldiers, these machines seemed to guarantee victory. But beneath the steel exterior lay weaknesses that propaganda concealed. Tanks were extraordinarily costly to build and maintain. A single Tiger tank required the industrial capacity and raw materials that could have produced dozens of lighter vehicles. They were prone to mechanical breakdowns, often immobilized not by enemy fire, but by clogged fuel lines, broken transmissions, or shortages of spare parts. On the Eastern Front, entire battalions were stranded when engines failed in the mud or froze in the brutal Russian winter. Production numbers told a more sobering story. Between 1940 and 1945, Germany built roughly 6,000 Tigers and Panthers combined. In contrast, the United States produced hundreds of thousands of vehicles of every kind: tanks, trucks, and above all, jeeps. German officers knew the figures, and many admitted privately that the Reich could never match the sheer volume of Allied production. Yet the faith in steel remained, both as a military doctrine and as a psychological anchor for a nation at war. To the German soldier, the tank was more than a weapon, it was reassurance. Facing overwhelming enemy numbers, he could look to the hulking silhouette of a Tiger and believe in German superiority. One officer later wrote, "We placed our trust in the machines. They were our pride, our shield, and our spear." But this faith carried a fatal flaw. It blinded the Wehrmacht to the importance of mobility and adaptability. While German strategy poured resources into perfecting fewer, heavier tanks, the Americans focused on versatility and numbers. Light vehicles, especially the Jeep, gave the U.S. Army unmatched flexibility. Where German armor struggled with fuel shortages and mechanical failures, American units relied on swarms of smaller machines to keep supply lines open, transport troops, and outmaneuver their opponents. The stage was set for a clash not only of armies, but of philosophies. Germany's reliance on heavy steel versus America's reliance on speed and numbers. For the German soldier, the tank remained the icon of war. Yet soon he would discover that the battlefield could be dominated not only by the roar of engines under thick armor, but also by the ceaseless hum of smaller machines that seemed to multiply without end. While Germany placed its faith in heavy armor, America looked towards something altogether different. In 1940, as war clouds darkened over Europe, the U.S. Army issued a challenge to industry: design a lightweight, durable, all-purpose vehicle that could serve in every corner of the battlefield. It needed to be fast, versatile, and simple enough to repair in the field. The specifications were ambitious: four-wheel drive, room for a squad of men or cargo, and the ability to tow small artillery pieces, all within a compact frame. Only a few companies dared to take up the call. Bantam, a small manufacturer, produced the first prototype, but it was Willis Overland and Ford that refined the design into what would become one of the most iconic vehicles in history. The result was a squat, unassuming machine with flat fenders, a boxy frame, and an engine that seemed to run forever. It was not glamorous, nor was it meant to be. The Jeep was built for purpose. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later call it one of the decisive weapons of World War II. In its simplicity lay its genius. A Jeep could be dropped by parachute, lashed to the deck of a transport ship, or crated and shipped by the thousands. It carried infantry, supplies, and ammunition. It could be fitted with radios for communication, stretchers for the wounded, or machine guns for fire support. No other vehicle in the war matched its adaptability. The numbers told the real story. By the time American factories reached full speed, Jeeps rolled off assembly lines at a staggering pace. Willis and Ford together produced over 600,000 by war's end, so many that they outnumbered Germany's most advanced tanks 100-fold. In Detroit and Toledo, the factories roared day and night, their conveyor belts feeding a war effort that measured success not in individual machines, but in endless supply. For German soldiers, accustomed to counting tanks as markers of strength, this was disorienting. On the battlefield, they often expected to meet steel with steel, Panzer against Sherman. Yet time and again, they saw instead a flood of jeeps darting across the landscape, carrying men, hauling equipment, or outflanking positions with unnerving speed. A German officer later recalled with frustration, "They were everywhere, faster than we could track, more numerous than we could count." The Jeep's impact went beyond tactics. It became a symbol of America's industrial philosophy, mass production, standardization, and adaptability. Where Germany invested in specialized weapons of great complexity, America built a single machine that could serve every purpose. It was cheap, expendable, and above all, available in overwhelming numbers. The battlefield presence of the Jeep was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had prepared for. Tanks were mighty, but they were also rare. A single Tiger could dominate a skirmish, but if it broke down or was surrounded, it was vulnerable. The Jeep, on the other hand, was never alone. If one was destroyed, 10 more appeared to take its place. To German eyes, this swarm of vehicles seemed less like an army of men and more like an army of machines, conjured endlessly from American factories. By 1942, the Jeep had become as recognizable to Allied soldiers as their rifles and helmets. Photographs from every theater of war, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, the Pacific, show the same squat silhouette against the dust, the mud, and the rubble. Soldiers gave it nicknames: the workhorse, the mighty might, and simply the GI's best friend. To the men who fought with it, the Jeep was not just transport. It was survival. In the contrast between Germany's reliance on heavy tanks and America's reliance on light vehicles, the story of industrial might was written clearly. One side built for perfection, the other for production. And as the war stretched on, it was the latter that proved decisive. The Jeep was more than steel and wheels. It was a statement that victory would not belong to the side with the largest tanks, but to the side with the greatest capacity to adapt, move, and outlast. The deserts of North Africa were unforgiving. Endless seas of sand stretched to the horizon, broken only by jagged ridges of rock and the shimmering haze of heat. Here, in this vast and hostile theater, the American Jeep faced its first great test against the seasoned veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps. German commanders had long relied on tanks and armored cars to dominate these expanses. But in the shifting dunes and rugged wadis, heavy machines often faltered. Tracks clogged with sand, engines overheated, and the logistical burden of fuel and parts slowed their momentum. Against this backdrop, the arrival of American Jeeps introduced a new kind of warfare: fast, flexible, and endlessly adaptable. The Jeep became the eyes and ears of the Allied advance. Light and quick, it darted ahead of columns to scout enemy positions, relaying information across the vast distances of desert. Units mounted radios on their frames, turning the little vehicle into mobile command posts. Others were outfitted with stretchers to evacuate the wounded or machine guns to harass enemy convoys. To German soldiers, it seemed as if the Allies had unleashed a swarm of mechanical insects, small, elusive, and impossible to pin down. One German officer later admitted, "The Jeeps appeared where we least expected them. They were behind us, beside us, in places our tanks could never reach." The frustration was palpable. German strategy had been built around controlling the battlefield with armored thrusts, yet these light vehicles refused to play by those rules. In supply, too, the Jeep proved decisive. The Afrika Korps had struggled for months with tenuous lifelines stretching back to Italy, hampered by Allied naval dominance and constant shortages. American forces, by contrast, could push Jeeps deep into the desert, carrying water, ammunition, and rations directly to the front. Convoys of Jeeps linked advancing units to their depots, keeping momentum alive where German formations often starved for fuel. The desert itself magnified the Jeep's strengths. Where heavy panzers sank into soft sand, jeeps skimmed lightly across the surface. Where mechanical breakdowns crippled German formations, Allied mechanics repaired jeeps on the spot with spare parts pulled from crates stacked in abundance. German soldiers noticed the difference. Captured prisoners recalled their amazement at how quickly damaged jeeps returned to service, while their own armored vehicles might be abandoned for lack of a single component. The psychological effect was no less significant. German troops, trained to gauge enemy strength by the number of tanks, were unsettled by an opponent that measured strength in mobility. Every dune seemed to hide another jeep patrol, every dust cloud another squad of fast-moving allies. The tempo of battle shifted. No longer could Rommel rely on his panzers to dictate the terms of engagement. The battlefield had become a contest of speed, and in this contest, the Americans held the advantage. For the Allies, the lessons were clear. Mobility was as decisive as firepower. The jeep allowed them to stretch the battlefield, to probe and exploit weaknesses in ways heavy armor could not. In the vast deserts of North Africa, where distances were measured in miles of sand and survival hinged on supply, the jeep was more than transport. It was the key to endurance. By the campaign's end, the Afrika Korps was in retreat, battered by superior logistics and relentless pressure. German prisoners, reflecting on their defeat, often pointed not only to Allied tanks or aircraft, but to the endless numbers of jeeps that swarmed the battlefield. They compared them to an enemy that multiplied endlessly, filling gaps, carrying men, and striking where they were least expected. In North Africa, the jeep earned its reputation as the Allies' most versatile weapon. More than a machine, it became a symbol of America's industrial reach, an arsenal on wheels that could adapt to any terrain, supply any need, and outlast any opponent. For German soldiers, the desert had revealed an uncomfortable truth. They were not just fighting an enemy army, but an industrial power that could turn even the smallest machine into a weapon of overwhelming advantage. The lessons of North Africa had been clear. Mobility was as decisive as firepower. When the Allies turned northward to Europe, they carried those lessons with them, and the jeep became a constant companion of every invasion, every push, and every advance. The first test came in Sicily, July 1943. As American and British troops stormed ashore, jeeps followed close behind. They rolled off landing craft and onto the beaches, their tires sinking briefly into the sand before climbing into the rugged hills beyond. In the choking dust of Sicilian roads, they ferried ammunition to frontline troops, carried wounded men to aid stations, and shuttled officers between rapidly shifting command posts. German defenders, already stretched thin, now faced an enemy whose mobility seemed to multiply by the hour. One diary entry, paraphrased years later, described the scene. They had machines everywhere, small, quick, tireless. We struck at one column, and another appeared behind us. In Italy, the jeep proved just as essential. Narrow mountain roads, impassable to tanks, became highways for the light vehicles. They carried supplies through rain and mud, pulled field guns into firing positions, and transported medics into places where stretchers alone could not go. Soldiers nicknamed them the Angels on Wheels, remembering how jeeps raced into minefields or artillery fire to retrieve the wounded. For the Germans holding defensive lines along the Gustav Line and later at Monte Cassino, the endless flow of vehicles underscored a grim reality. Their enemy could move faster and sustain itself more easily than they ever could. But nowhere did the swarm of wheels reveal its full power more dramatically than in Normandy, June 1944. On D-Day, as the beaches of Omaha and Utah burned with gunfire, jeeps rolled off landing craft in steady streams. Many were equipped with stretchers, rushing casualties back to improvised aid posts. Others carried ammunition crates through the surf, keeping the invasion supplied despite chaos. Within hours, jeeps were rumbling inland, threading through hedgerows and villages, scouting routes for advancing infantry. The German defenders, bracing for armored assaults, found themselves bewildered. Tanks they could understand, jeeps, in such numbers, were something else entirely. For every jeep destroyed, more arrived, unloaded from ships that seemed to deliver an unending flow of men and machines. One German officer later reflected, We measured our victories in tanks destroyed. But the Americans measured theirs in how fast they moved forward. Their little cars never stopped. As the campaign in France unfolded, the Jeep adapted to countless roles. Some were fitted with radios to coordinate artillery strikes. Others mounted machine guns, transforming into fast-moving assault platforms that harassed German convoys. Entire units of paratroopers relied on Jeeps dropped from gliders to give them speed behind enemy lines. To the Wehrmacht, it seemed an absurd paradox. Their most advanced machines, the Tigers and Panthers, were outmaneuvered by vehicles so light they could be lifted by plane. The psychological toll was immense. German troops could feel triumph when one of their prized tanks knocked out an American Sherman. But when they disabled a Jeep, the victory felt hollow. For every wrecked vehicle, 10 more seemed to take its place, rolling out of Normandy's fields and along its roads like a tide that could not be stopped. Slowly, painfully, it became clear that their engineering brilliance was being drowned beneath the weight of American production. The Jeep was not glamorous, nor was it the most powerful weapon of the war. Yet by Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, it had become indispensable. To German soldiers, its swarm-like presence was both bewildering and demoralizing. To the Allies, it was proof that the war would be won not only with tanks and aircraft, but with the countless wheels of a machine that carried their armies across Europe. The battles fought in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy revealed the Jeep as a decisive weapon of mobility. But behind every Jeep that rolled into the dust of North Africa or the mud of France stood something even more formidable: the industrial might of the United States. The true war was not only fought with bullets and shells, but with rivets, steel, and conveyor belts. In Detroit, Toledo, and across the American Midwest, factories thundered day and night. Assembly lines that had once produced cars, tractors, and household goods were converted almost overnight into engines of war. Civilian automobiles disappeared from showrooms, replaced by Jeeps, trucks, and tanks rolling off the lines at a pace no enemy could hope to match. At the height of production, one Jeep was completed every 2 minutes, each identical in design, each ready to be shipped across oceans. Germany, by contrast, struggled under the weight of its own ambition. Its tanks, Tigers and Panthers, were masterpieces of engineering, but they were complex, expensive, and painfully slow to produce. Precision craftsmanship demanded time, and Allied bombing raids frequently disrupted supply chains and destroyed key facilities. Even when the Reich managed to roll new machines out of its factories, shortages of fuel and spare parts often left them stranded before they ever reached the battlefield. For German soldiers, the difference became apparent in captivity. Prisoners of war transported to camps in America sometimes glimpsed the very heart of the industrial machine they had been fighting. They were stunned by endless rows of vehicles, tractors, and harvesters, by factories that seemed to stretch on without end. One recalled, "We realized then that our fight had been hopeless. Their machines were too many, their factories too strong." The numbers were staggering. Germany produced roughly 46,000 tanks during the entire war. America, by comparison, produced over 600,000 Jeeps, 2 million trucks, and tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft. Where the Reich built weapons with painstaking care, the United States embraced standardization and mass production. A broken part on a Jeep in Normandy could be replaced in minutes with spares shipped directly from Detroit. A Tiger tank, once disabled, might sit for days waiting for a component that never arrived. The contrast extended to the workforce itself. In Germany, skilled laborers were drafted into the army, leaving factories short-handed and dependent on forced labor. In America, women and men from every background filled the lines, Rosie the Riveter becoming the symbol of a home front united in purpose. The same hands that once stitched clothing or assembled radios now riveted aircraft fuselages and tightened bolts on Jeeps bound for the front. The battlefield reflected this imbalance. German divisions might deploy a handful of tanks, but they faced Allied formations supported by fleets of Jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks, all supplied by an industrial base that seemed inexhaustible. The Jeep became the visible reminder of America's economic advantage: small, cheap, and everywhere. For the German soldiers staring across a battlefield dotted with these vehicles, the realization was sobering. Defeating an enemy meant more than knocking out a tank or repelling an assault. It meant confronting an industrial giant that could replace every loss tenfold. As one prisoner later confessed, "We fought bravely, but against their factories, we had no chance." The Jeep's ubiquity was not simply a matter of battlefield utility. It was a symbol of a deeper truth. America's war machine was not only stronger, it was unstoppable. The factories of the Midwest, untouched by bombing and fueled by a mobilized nation, became as decisive a weapon as any gun or tank. And as the war ground on, the Germans who once believed in the invincibility of their steel realized the true balance of power lay not in craftsmanship alone, but in the relentless rhythm of American assembly lines. By the middle years of the war, the contrast between German steel and American mobility had become impossible to ignore. The German army still fielded some of the most formidable tanks ever built: the Tiger, the Panther, and the improved Panzer IV. Each was a masterpiece of engineering, bristling with firepower and protected by thick armor. Yet these machines, once symbols of battlefield dominance, increasingly found themselves isolated, stranded, and starved of fuel. Against them came not only Allied tanks, but a relentless tide of mechanized support vehicles. Jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks swarmed the roads of France and Belgium, ensuring that supplies, reinforcements, and ammunition never ceased to flow. Where German divisions slowed, the Allies pressed on, their columns stretching for miles, every gap filled by wheels. At Normandy, after the brutal landings of June 1944, Jeeps played a vital role in keeping the invasion alive. They ferried ammunition across the chaos of the beachhead, carried wounded men to field hospitals, and threaded through hedgerows with reconnaissance patrols. For the Germans, expecting a grinding clash of armor, the constant presence of these light vehicles was unsettling. One officer later reflected, "We could destroy their tanks, but the Americans seemed never to run out of movement." Their vehicles were everywhere. As the Allies broke out of Normandy in Operation Cobra, speed became the decisive factor. German tanks, low on fuel and increasingly vulnerable to Allied air power, struggled to reposition. American Jeeps, meanwhile, darted down back roads, bypassing strong points and linking advancing infantry with artillery behind the lines. The pace of the offensive left German commanders scrambling, their carefully planned defenses crumbling under the weight of constant pressure. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 underscored the imbalance. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German forces launched their last great offensive, deploying hundreds of tanks in a desperate bid to split the Allied front. For a time, the attack gained ground. Yet the German advance soon slowed, not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel tanks. Panthers and Tigers, magnificent on the firing line, stood useless along snowy roadsides, abandoned for lack of gasoline. American Jeeps, on the other hand, moved tirelessly through the winter landscape. They carried fuel cans to frontline Shermans, delivered messages across broken lines, and ferried men through snow and ice. To German soldiers shivering in foxholes, it seemed as if the enemy's machines never stopped coming. Eyewitness accounts from German officers captured the frustration. One admitted, "Our tanks could dominate in battle, but too often they never reached the battle at all." Meanwhile, the Americans supplied their armies as if by magic. It was not magic, of course, but the product of a vast industrial machine. Factories across the ocean turning out vehicles in numbers Germany could not hope to match. By 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. German armored spearheads, designed to deliver swift and decisive blows, were being strangled not by superior tanks, but by mobility itself. The Allies moved faster, supplied more efficiently, and kept up a tempo of operations the Wehrmacht could not sustain. Tanks that once terrified Europe now sat idle, while Jeeps buzzed past, carrying the war deeper into the Reich. The turning tide of the war was not marked by a single battle, but by this relentless imbalance. German steel had been built for dominance, but America's wheels ensured inevitability. The Jeep, simple and unassuming, became the quiet instrument of a revolution in warfare, proof that in modern conflict, numbers, speed, and supply could crush even the most formidable machines. By 1945, The war that had begun with the thunder of German armor ended with the steady hum of American wheels. Across Europe, jeeps rolled through liberated towns, their flat silhouettes as familiar to civilians as the sight of Allied flags. For the German soldier who had once trusted in the might of steel, the memory of those endless swarms of light vehicles remained vivid. Tanks had been their pride, their symbol of superiority. Yet it was the jeep, humble, fast, and innumerable, that marked the advance of the armies that defeated them. The jeep became more than a battlefield tool. It became a cultural icon. Allied soldiers spoke of it with affection, calling it the workhorse, the faithful servant, the little machine that never failed. Photographs captured jeeps climbing mountains, crossing rivers, and carrying generals who plotted campaigns that reshaped the world. To the Americans, it represented adaptability and ingenuity. To the Germans, it represented futility, the proof that industrial numbers, not engineering perfection, would decide the war's outcome. Historians later emphasized the jeep's significance. It was not simply a vehicle of war, it was a symbol of a new doctrine. Mobility had triumphed over massed armor. Logistics had proven as decisive as guns. The jeep's role in reconnaissance, supply, and medical evacuation showed that modern warfare demanded versatility more than specialization. In this way, the lessons of the jeep influenced not only the Allied advance in 1945, but also the post-war doctrines of NATO armies, which placed increasing emphasis on mobility and rapid deployment. For German veterans, recollections of jeeps often carried a tone of disbelief. Some remembered their tanks idling on empty fuel, while jeeps buzzed past without pause. Others described how every attempt to strike at Allied supply lines was met with more vehicles than they could destroy. One prisoner later reflected, "We thought the Tiger was invincible. But it was not the tank that beat us. It was the little car that never stopped coming." In the years that followed, the jeep entered civilian life much as it had entered the war, simply and everywhere. Surplus vehicles were sold to farmers, adventurers, and builders. Its rugged design inspired generations of civilian off-road vehicles, embedding itself into the fabric of post-war culture. It became a symbol not only of military victory, but also of resilience, freedom, and the ability to rebuild after devastation. Yet at its heart, the jeep's legacy remained bound to the astonishment of its enemies. The Germans, who had once believed in the supremacy of armored divisions, had been forced to accept a new reality. Victory in the modern age did not belong to the largest gun or the thickest armor. It belonged to the side that could outproduce, outmaneuver, and outlast. And so the story came full circle. What began with German disbelief on the battlefields of North Africa and Normandy ended with a lesson etched into the history of war. That simplicity, multiplied by industry, could overcome even the most formidable machines of steel. The jeep had carried men, weapons, and hope across continents. More than that, it had carried the Allies to victory. In the dust trails left behind those countless vehicles, the legacy of the Second World War was written, not only in steel and fire, but in wheels and determination. The jeep was not just a machine. It was the symbol of a new kind of warfare, and a reminder that even the mightiest tanks could be outnumbered, outpaced, and ultimately outdone by simplicity turned into strength.